Okay, excellent. And I'm not sure if we're welcoming back people who are online. And I should have apologized earlier that we would be losing people online during the workshop. But welcome anyway back. And right, we're now going to start with a feedback from each of the workshop chairs, and that's 15 to 20 minutes, Rosa, if that's okay. Yeah. Well, and hopefully what I would like to do is have time for discussion during this feedback, and then at the end a little bit of time to go through sort of a consolidation of guiding principles and see if the group could agree that. So I'd like to welcome Professor Rosa Gini, who's Head of Medical Informatics and Pharmacoepidemiology at the Regional Agency of Health in Tuscany. Is that right? Yes.
And I'm just Dr. Squared.
Oh, doctor. Oh, you're not Professor. Right. Just clearly been involved in lots of European initiatives and very kindly led the first workshop. So over to you, Rosa. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for this organization. And I think this first group, I think the work was very nice, partly based on all the very relevant information we had in the past 2 days. So, yes. So basically the question was, what are the specific European barriers and challenges in applying a common data model? We tried to do two things at the same time, so identifying them and also trying to come up with some principle to address them. So the first one is that the initiative needs to be sustainable. So there should be funding, but also ideally a legal basis for this to happen. That compliance with European legislation on data protection should be sought. And of course, there is heterogeneity in that, and this is a challenge, of course. And also data access has heterogeneous characteristics, both at the technical and governance level, and this should be respected. And this is a huge challenge, and we know that. This is not only legal, I mean. And then the principle was also coming from the previous days, from today, this morning and yesterday, to work closely with data partners, both, first to leverage on their expertise on data methodology, and also beyond funding, also some benefits could be delivered to partners from this initiative. Then we had some work on governance at two levels. So governance of the common data model itself, it should involve data partners and other key stakeholders. And the initiatives should be endorsed by relevant European bodies, among which EMA, and that's beyond the legal framework that we mentioned in the previous slide. And it should build and apply established code of conduct, among which the NCEP code of conduct and the advanced code of conduct. And then the governance should also ensure that not only the application of the CDM, but the CDM itself is sustainable together with its processes and analytics. And then we have a list of principles regarding transparency and documentation, which is felt to be the CDM version of transparency. So heterogeneity of data sources, data transformation, quality assurance, analytics processes should all be transparent and documented, and results of the studies should be published. And then this is more on the technical level. So the first one builds on the recommendation of Jim of this morning to try to capture the validity of the data and try to operationalize this. You understand? Yeah. And so we incorporated this principle in our list. Of course, that's obvious. We speak multiple languages, and we have several coding terminology, so that should be addressed by the common data model. And but also there are European standards, and so that should be leveraged, and also other standards, including ISO SPOR. And then the CDM, we have seen this in several presentations. It should incorporate free text to leverage from richness of local data. And for the same reason, it should incorporate all data, also those that cannot be mapped. And then at the implementation stage, we have seen that all the successful CDMs described had an iterative approach in the development. So they started from simple use cases, core, like safety, utilization, and effectiveness in this case, we would suggest. But then trying to ensure extendability to wider use case, for instance, relative effectiveness, which is a relevant topic. And also, we should have an focus on EMA and regulatory decisions, but have also an eye to the utility for other stakeholders, like HTA bodies or ECDC or similar European organization. Oh no, yes, that's basically all. So, are there any questions?
No questions at all? Any questions, any comments? I'm sort of feeling this is sort of touching on a lot of the other groups as well, and whether we should go through all of them and then have a general discussion around all of the principles. I don't know.
Just question on clarity?
Any particular issues that anybody would like to raise? Yes, Bert.
I think a very nice presentation. I was wondering this iterative nature you propose as a group, what this iterative means in terms of timing or in parallel, or any discussions you had on that aspect?
Well, that was not a deep discussion, but what we saw basically from all the examples we saw that it was that there were, I think the CORNET spoke about 4 versions in 3 years, 4 versions of the common data model to embrace more and more cases. So that's something we should expect, that we start with something and then we grow. But that's not a definitive answer.
I suppose that there's a... Oh, sorry. Would you like?
Yeah, thanks, Alison. Sturkenboom, European Commission. I'm very glad that you insisted on this legal base dimension, which is indeed key. I mean, for Group 1, there were lots of discussion in the beginning on how to overcome the challenges and opportunities of the GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation. So indeed, that's the first work we have to fix through the implementation of this regulation. I think that the second challenge we have, indeed, from a legislative perspective, is the compliance of using real-world data and this model for the purpose for regulatory purposes. How far is this compliant with the EU legislation on pharma? I would say that more and more actors, also with legal perspective, now understand the absolute need to process this data. And member states themselves, so they have set up together with the EMA a task force to look at the legal compliance of such a common data model with the pharma legislation. And finally, so there will be, for your information, there will be early 18, a proposal at EU level for cooperation on HTA. And one of the pillar of this cooperation is indeed interaction between HTA and payers' needs and regulatory needs. So in this respect, that will be certainly a hook for justifying the collection and the use of real-world data and common through the use of common data models in the EU. But you know, there is lots of discussion at EU level, not only in the pharma area, but cooperation of healthcare systems. So you mentioned indeed rightly the ISO IDMP terminology. But on healthcare system, there are lots of discussion between member states on the use of SNOMED city terminologies, for instance. And that's very much linked with this discussion. Thanks a lot.
Some of us, or shall I be specific, Ron Herrings and I were talking about the jealousy we have of the situation in the US, where they can obtain their data quite freely. I must confess I feel a sense of despair with the General Data Protection Regulation. There are two issues to it. One is what the actual regulation does that creates barriers to doing good epidemiology. And the second is the barriers that are put there by the interpretation of that regulation in individual places, not just between countries, but within countries and within health service systems, that people will interpret it in ways that are bad. And as I said, there are practices in the UK who now will not give their data to be allowed for research. And I think that it is a great shame, just as the UK population voted in almost total ignorance of what the consequences of Brexit were. Similarly, I think the European legislators have brought in the GDPR in almost total ignorance of the effect that it will actually have on epidemiology. Because as we make data less and less available, and in particular, it is not random removal of the data, it is non-random removal of the data. And it is people, for example, who think they have stigmatizing conditions who remove their data, who may be the very people for whom our doing the work would bring benefit. And they, in ignorance, do not wish to have their data included. And I think this is very unfortunate, and I don't know what the answers are going to be. But one of the consequences is that the uncertainties in the analyses we have will become greater and greater. And I just want to say something that I said only at coffee, that I think Olaf yesterday gave what could have been taken as a misleading interpretation. Lots of people who are not epidemiologists in very good knowledge think that all misclassification of outcomes and so on leads biases towards the null. This is not true. Among others, Dick Cronmile, Sue Chin in different papers have shown with specific examples where particularly even with outcomes that are misclassified, especially where the outcome involves change, can lead to movement away from the null through misclassification. And so the consequence of losing data, which effectively missing data and misclassification can be seen as part of the same thing, we're going to find that our results are becoming less and less reliable. Maybe it's because I'm an old man and pessimistic.
I think what you say is very true. The problem is that you are talking to, I think each of us here is convinced about what you say. And our role is to make sure that these messages are passed to, for instance, at EU level, other ministries which are discussing the implementation of the GDPR. This is what we try to do at European Commission level, but you can see that even engaging the ministries of health into this debate is difficult. So we need to maximize the outcome of this workshop so that people within the ministries of health, but also in ministries of interior, of justice, are aware of these issues, because otherwise they will have a different understanding of what needs to be done. And that's our challenge.
I would only comment that at recent workshops that I've attended around it, that the data protection agencies are aware of the possible sort of lack of harmonization in terms of how they interpret and implement the GDPR. So I think there is an awareness there around building a sort of a consistent picture, but it's very challenging because of different legislation in different member states. So I think, however, I think the good news is there is a real awareness of some of the difficulties. Are there any other comments from Rosa's presentation? In that case, maybe we'll move on to Miriam and we'll come back to discuss it. Thank you very much, Rosa. So group 2, which I'm desperately looking for the title here, was how do you operationalize a CDM network? And it was led by Professor Miriam Sturkenboom, who is a professor of pharmacoepidemiology working at the University Medical Center at Utrecht. And she has been involved in many, many EU initiatives over the years, and so has excellent background knowledge around this topic. So thank you very much, Miriam.
Thank you, Alison. So also, I mean, I've enjoyed a lot this workshop, so thank you to be here and to be invited and to be able to report back. We had actually quite excellent discussions into a little bit more of the detail of how you do this, and we could actually profit from the presence of our colleagues from CNODES and Sentinel and PCORNET, who have tackled many of the problems on how to actually operationalize a network that is doing, working on the basis of a CDM. So we were going beyond just like what is the technicality of a CDM, but really then how do you work? So the first thing that we tackled a bit is like, what is the hurdles? Like, why don't we have a sustainable system in Europe currently? And it's something that we haven't discussed a lot in the larger audience here, but it has a lot to do with funding, of course. So we have had all of these like FP7 projects that EMA asked for. We have the Innovative Medicines Initiative projects, but somehow there is lack of a sustainable system. So it's about funding and it's about sustainable funding. And Xavier gave us some input about what how EMA is seeing this, like how would they want to pay for this, or how do they want such a system that is totally desirable in Europe, how it should be paid. And I think, so the perspective is, I think there are two levels. One is on a political level that are ongoing discussions together with ECDC, I think at the Commission level, but I don't know the further details of that, but that is ongoing. And as a, my personal wish would be that the Commission, and given their presence here, is that they take this on. And it's really important, I think, for Europe to also have a system like Sentinel or CNODES or anything else, but a sustainable part. And then, so the EMA, I think, currently are seeing that there are multiple cost items. One is for setting up the infrastructure, so it's the basic funding of infrastructure. Then there is a cost item about maintenance and running the system. And then the third is about running studies. So these are three different cost items that may actually be addressed differently. I think if we look at the databases, the input from the databases, the few ones that were there actually, that is that they would really wish to get funding for the first implementation of the, the CDM and making it happen, because that is seems to be the biggest cost of all. So that is something that needs to be done. So then the experience in the PCORNET and Sentinel and CNODES, and we didn't have anybody from Odyssey there. So, but anyway, the experience there is that the manufacturers they can work with the data access providers separately. So it's so what has happened is that there's a lot of basic funding in the US and in Canada as well to set up the system, as we have heard. The amounts vary between the two initiatives, and PCORNET also has a lot of money to set up. And how they actually now leverage their infrastructural building with the manufacturers that also need data access and to comply with regulatory issues is that they have Sentinel has set up IMED, so they can actually access through the IMED system. And what was quite interesting to learn is that there have been a lot of policy and procedures set up to actually do that, so to give access to the manufacturers and have them a role while working with the same databases that Sentinel is using as well, and also using the same tools. To my understanding, CNODES has, CNODES is, Health Canada is paying for the setup in the infrastructural part and for running studies if needed or if requested. But the partners there also provide a lot of in-kind contributions. So there is a lot of leveraging on that academic, maybe salaries, etc., that are going in there. So one of the key questions that came up is if CNODES goes to this common data model approach, who's going to pay for that? And I think it's something that hasn't been solved yet. But I think this is also what we need to solve in Europe, like who will be paying for this. So then we came to talk about what is in it for the people that actually participate in it. So what are the value propositions for the databases that want to participate? And there is, maybe it's not spoken about, but there is hesitancy amongst databases that if they convert that data into a common data model, that then somebody could just, that they lose the role that they currently have in executing studies. So I think that's a little bit of where sensitivity arises. So we had a lot of talk about like involvement of data partners, and we learned from the Sentinel that, they really involved the data partners at the beginning. So they really got them in because Rich Platt was reaching out to each of these data providers or data partners individually and sat around the table. So it was really about leadership and trust in the person actually doing it, that people were actually engaging in this endeavor. What was interesting is also that PCORNET was slightly different. So the money came on the table first, and then so you can actually see the difference in interest when that happens. So whether it's money driven or whether it's really about, science driven and public health driven makes a difference. So what are other enabling factors to get the databases on board? We made a tour of the people there actually. So the key driver to want to participate is actually the public health part. So the wish to improve public health, which is a mission that many of the data access providers, have. So that's the common denominator. And then there needs just to be clarity about, the workload, the processes. There needs to be trust in the leadership. There needs, and this is very important. And of course, there needs to be transparency and security provided. So this is one of the other enabling factors could also be is that that it would be nice if there could be an upfront clearance that data can be utilized for public health purposes, such as Sentinel, I think. So it would be great if the GDPR, has some of this provision of clearance for use of data. That would help a lot, if not every time you need to get approvals from the various member states. And I think this, so one of the suggestions that also came is that what could probably happen, and I think this was from Xavier, was asking what could be the role of NCEP, because Andrew Bates, I think, was stating what is really needed in Europe potentially to pull this off is that there are key opinion leaders within the NCEP network that actually get together and convince that they want to do this and then change the other members of the network so that they get this endorsement. So something needs to happen that people feel trust to actually engage in this. Then we were talking about decision-making and organization because, we haven't spoken about that, but it's actually quite complex when you work in these large stakeholder groups and multiple stakeholders with multiple interests and priorities. Leslie was very nice actually in stating like there is a continuum somehow in what we see here, whereas on the one hand, Sentinel being very tightly organized with a partnership and a contractual arrangement and very clear hierarchy in decision-making. Whereas, on the other hand, we have the open community type where like the decision-making process is open, it's community decision-making. And so we spoke a little bit about what feels comfortable in certain situations, and we didn't look at all the possible use cases, but just the regulatory use case. So what if you do a regulatory requested study, what would people feel comfortable with? And I think the group was agreeing, and especially the industry partners in there, is that when you need a regulatory required study, it feels a little bit uncomfortable if you have this open community, because they need more reassurance and coordination and organization. And please, if I say something wrong, come back to me later. But of course, we didn't have all the manufacturers there, but there was this notion. So we spoke then about how the OMOP common data model that is embraced by many of the organizations is being utilized. And what we see now is that they often use it in-house for doing a lot of preparatory work. So they do have data in the OMOP common data model and use the tools, and it's very nice. But once a study needs to be done for regulators, they actually would then outsource it to somewhere else or do it in a different way. So I think that's important to realize and to see how that may actually be improved, that you have a better organizational structure. So then we also spoke about scientific independence, and especially I think this is, I think across all of these projects that are currently happening, such as Sentinel and CNODES and Odyssey, and also in advance, there is full openness, like open protocols listed, the open reports, open tools, so everything is transparent, and the group was agreeing that that's a requirement, so it's really a condition for trust in the system that everything is open. And then we spoke a little about industry participation because in the US now, I mean, when Sentinel was set up, initially that was not possible, but now it's actually done through IMETS in a certain way. I think in Europe we are in quite a different situation because the opportunities that we have now are often through the Innovative Medicines Initiative where you really have a partnership. So that's even all the policies and the procedures, I mean, it's even complex because we have a larger stakeholder group, I guess. So the European reality is quite complex and needs to be managed, especially regarding this scientific independence. But I think then transparency is a great good in this. So I think this is what I wrote up during the break. Is there any of the group members that wants to add anything or make a modification? Yeah.
Yeah, President, one comment. First of all, congratulations for having summarized the open discussion so nicely. It was difficult. But I think one thing that I've really also heard is that it is very important if we apply a common data model in Europe that a common data model should be agreed with and accepted by the database data partners, by the database owner. That and that maybe the ideal situation would be to have one common data model agreed by a data partner, because the experience that we have so far that you may have different organizations that use a data model on the same database with different results. We don't know what is the good result actually. So that having one common data model agreed by the data. Well, yes. you know better than me.
So thank you, Xavier. Thank you for adding that point. So I think yes, the discussion was that the data partners need to decide. So they have a key role actually. So they need to be part of the decision making in that, and they also there should be one person transforming their data. It should not be multiple persons. So it needs to be one, and they need to sign it off. I think that was the agreement. So the data partners are really important in terms of signing off on the quality of their data transformations.
I just wondered if we could ask maybe Patrick, how does he imagine, or how could we imagine that regulatory questions could be asked through sort of an open community type network where voluntary may not necessarily work, or we would at least need buy-in from enough partners. I just wonder if because the Odyssey community of courseware protocols are posted and it's completely voluntary as to whether you opt in or not. I just wondered if you could speculate on how you could envisage such a network working as they weren't in the room.
Sure. So I think John actually did a nice job of summarizing that. What we're trying to do within the Odyssey community is be an enabler to allow networks to be created. And there are certainly lots of examples of networks that represent subsets of partners who have banded together to support a particular need. And so I would imagine that if the EMA had an expectation to impose an obligation on data partners to deliver in some responsive thing, then that is the type of contractual arrangement you would like to have. So you could imagine identifying partners within a community who you want to contract with, and now you have a contractual relationship that could still be using the same underlying infrastructure and technology, but now you actually have that mandate that would be afforded by a contract and support. That said, some questions you might have responsibility and an obligation to and a need to get that because maybe the question is not of sufficient public health interest that anybody would necessarily just volunteer to do. But other times you might be asking questions for which there's enough shared value in a community that there's interest in engaging. Just as the pointed example from yesterday, there was a sufficient discussion of uncertainty about radium-223. I posted that on the voluntary, on our forums to say, will anybody help the EMA? And already there's been responses from Korea and multiple sites in the US and Europe. So that's happened in 12 hours. Answers to your question from yesterday are posted. Nobody got paid to do that. There is no data quality assurance to guarantee that the answers that are out there are right. However, if heeding Stephen's call and June's request, if you needed to know, are we dealing with a small problem or a big problem? Are we dealing with a small proportion or a big proportion? You might be able to get approximate answers quickly using some hybrid approach.
Mm-hmm.
Christian.
Actually, yeah, I wanted to say something to that too. Like, there is there's a dichotomy between an approach being necessarily open and contractually defined. And so, for example, our company does commercial work, in particular also safety studies, for example, for the FDA. We discussed this earlier for reasons that there's certain data availability and ability to turn things around at a faster pace. So that's perfectly well possible. It doesn't exclude. It's not like, if you go for an OMOP approach, then it has to be loosey-goosey up in the air and nobody knows, okay? You can form a network which is very well defined, has even obligations if you so choose. Nothing speaks against it. It also should be considered for what Miriam was talking earlier is the funding. So to assume that there's only one way of funding, which is one central entity, takes a whole lot of money into their hand. And so some of the networks did appear that way in the US, puts a whole lot of money on the table, and then a bunch of organizations sign up, receive money, and then do what they're supposed to do. This is probably not the most economic way of doing it. It leaves out, and it did so with the Sentinel situation, the private sector, who have not only the same need, they also have the same right to get to the data. It's not like, they're the bad guys and therefore they shouldn't get the data. They should get the data in order to even avoid the kind of things that we then try to then rectify after market approval. And they should bear the cost for that. And you can do that. So instead of saying, okay, first I build it, and then I let them in, paying another time for the same thing again, isn't probably the best way of doing it. And then the final one on the same notion is there's actually a cottage industry of private sector companies, again, like the one I work for, so that's why I can say that, whose business model it is to do these kind of things, to create these networks, to aggregate data, to convert data. I don't know how much data conversion we are doing internally. We have a whole ton of data in Europe that are either available natively or in a converted form. And they're doing it as a private sector, so they have some way of getting efficiency out of it over time. And I would strongly recommend not to leave that kind of thing on the table. Of people who have been doing in that business of data aggregation, quality checking, validation, making sure that you can get the right answer, creating services around it for commercial purposes, and scaling it up well so that it can be available to the stakeholders, at a much more economic way.
Thank you for that example, Christian. Yeah.
So my name is Colin Carroll. I'm from the IMI, which many of you may not know. We're a funding agency. We're both public and private, so the public's from the Commission and the private's from the pharmaceutical industry in Europe. And just to speak on the funding issue, which you presented, Miriam, many of you are aware, but I guess some of you are not, that we funded many of the projects which were already mentioned in the past couple of days. And we have a big future project, which is in quite a delicate stage at the moment. But the ambition is to curate the data of 100 million European citizens to the OMOP model. and we're providing the funding for that. So that will kickstart it, I think, in Europe, but we cannot address the sustainability problem. We're not equipped to do that. So what happens after we've done this is still to be seen.
Well, thank you very much. And I think that's actually the situation as it has been many times with AMIF and with Advance and many of the previous projects, that somehow there's funding and then the project is over and we cannot keep it going. So anybody else?
I mean, I'd also like to comment on that issue, because it's such a waste of resources if the sustainability is not considered at the start. And I think we do have to start to prioritize sustainability, because the buy-in from the community will not be there unless there is a thought around how we can sustain these activities. And it is a wasted effort and also leads to a duplication of effort as well. So I know that you don't have the mechanisms to fund it, but I do think that needs to be on the table right at the beginning and in the sort of thought process. Please.
There was also the mention that people from industry use OMOP initially, but then turn to some other method if it's a regulatory requirement. And I think there's a chicken and egg aspect here, because the regulatory agencies are frequently pointing at certain things that they would like used. If the regulatory agencies say, we think OMOP is a perfectly good system, and we'll examine that a study was properly done and so forth, but being done using the OMOP tools or data structure is not a disadvantage, then I think a lot of that reluctance would evaporate instantly.
Thank you. Is there anybody that was in your group that wants to comment on that? Yeah.
No, I agree also, but the question is, what do we need to be able to say that indeed this we can have trust in the result, and this is really the core question. What are the requirements, and what do we need to be able to say that? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the chicken and the egg thing. So somehow I think everybody is waiting, like, to which common data model do we convert? Because otherwise we end up doing it in different versions, and nobody's taking that decision actually. So
well, but actually what we have seen yesterday is that basically PCORNET started from Sentinel with the project of evolving from that. So that's probably, according also to the result of what the workgroup 1 said, that is probably what we should also do. I mean, start with something and then start from that, starting with some use cases that create the trust also in the regulatory environment and in the databases. So starting from something that is maybe available there or blah, blah, simple, and then...
Could I just comment on the wearing my industry hat at Janssen? I think we need to not lose touch of the fact that when we talk about industry engaging with the regulators on a observational study, you're supposed to be talking about your best practice that you're applying from source data all the way to how you generate evidence. And whether or not you use a CDM, I mean, I don't know what kind of conversation you have if you've licensed a data set from IQVIA. Do they challenge you about the source data schema that you receive from the vendor? Of course not. You don't even know what that is. That's completely opaque to the entire process. So whether your starting point was you got a data set from IQVIA in its source native format, or you licensed the data and it happened to show up at your door in a OMOP CDM format, it's a data set that you're starting with, and you should be accountable just for describing the provenance of how you got the data, and you should equally be accountable for describing what did you do once you got the data. So I was actually quite interested in that comment because at Janssen, we convert all of our data to CDM. It's the only thing we know to do the appropriate data quality to ensure that our studies have integrity. I honestly don't know how I would do a study if I didn't have the tools and practices in place. And so, all of our responses that we've had in submissions to PRAC have all been predicated on that. And I'm not even sure what I would do with a comment that said I'm not allowed to do it, because I don't know how I would respond to the clinical question of interest without the data quality and the processes in place that we've built as part of our organization.
If there's no further questions, that maybe that's a nice segue actually into work group 3, which was around validation and entitled, "What are the key criteria necessary for validation of a CDM in Europe?" Thank you, Miriam. And it was led by Stephen Evans, who needs no introduction, but I will anyway. So Stephen was for 25 years at the London Hospital and Medical College, where he was worked in statistics and computing, and then briefly actually at the UK Medicines Control Agency, where we worked together actually. Yeah. And then and is now a European Commission appointed independent expert member of the Pharmacovigilance and Risk Assessment Committee here at the EMA, as well as a professor of pharmacoepidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Alison, I thought the definition of an expert was a drip under pressure, but there we go. I'm sorry, I think I was a very bad chair of our group, but there we go. They had to put up with me. We had some questions for discussion, and if it weren't for Patricia McGettigan, we wouldn't have really got anywhere. She did a great job in total silence, or almost total silence, in producing these wonderful slides. And so when we come to our questions, individual variables that should be checked, our answer was all of them, but that was the sort of checking that you have that just checks that they're present and so on. We couldn't provide a specific list of priority. It would require a great deal more time. And we thought that the ETL checks that you have are going to involve the whole data. And it's become very clear that one of the key elements of a common data model is not what I can recall people many, many years ago having common data models that weren't done by computer scientists and others. But what they did was they found a subset of variables that were present in all the databases, and they contracted their data to only have the variables that were in common with all of them. And that kind of idea is now very much old hat, and that isn't what you should think of a common data model to be. And Christian made it very clear that the common data models are incorporating all the data from the original source data set. But undoubtedly, the checking does need to be done more critically on certain variables. And we didn't think we could go through that in any detail. The sort of features of the variables that should be considered, absolute counts and proportions, yes. We felt that a lot of things should be looking essentially at rates of things and proportions rather than just counts, so that we had a sense of where the variability in the data was between different data sets, for example, different data sets from the same source provider over time and different providers, and that this would lead to particular challenges in Europe. I would just say that we didn't discuss it, but I mentioned very briefly at some point, how many of you have used kurtosis for checking data? Patrick, Ron, one or two others. It's a fantastic thing to use when you've got continuous measurements, because it's an extraordinarily strong indicator of outlying values. But actually outliers aren't the only things you should be looking at. Anyway, I think that one of the things that we learned very clearly from Jeff was that their experience with lab data is really very testing, very challenging, I think. I think it's what the EMA is going through in Brexit. It's challenging. And the same thing happens with lab data in common data models. But I think the idea that we will get the source data absolutely perfectly transmitted into a common data model cannot be true. It won't be absolutely perfect. And I think, we had lots of disagreement, but we were all in agreement that trying to have an unrealistic target of that kind would be very foolish, very foolish. I think we wanted to distinguish, and we thought that John, I think's description of validation occurring in 4 quadrants was quite helpful, and software validation we saw as separate from the CDM. What criteria should be applied to prompt additional checks? And one of the things that we wanted to distinguish was the idea that the source data had been moved in correct form in accordance with data dictionaries or definitions, and that was something that was very simple to say it must be done, and that had to be done very carefully. And the openness, transparency, and contestability of this was going to be an important part of common data models. Being honest, when we look back at pharmacoepidemiology over the years, this was not done. People used CPRD or GPRD in ways that were totally non-transparent. And we believed the results then, and we possibly were unaware of the sort of processing that was done of that data prior to the analysis being done. And CPRD now has some checks of that kind, but again, not an enormous amount, and we don't always know exactly what has been removed as a result. Consistency across different data sets has limitations. Trends against expectations need checking, obviously. There was a lot of disagreement, in a sense, about a reference set of known effects, and Jeff in particular thought that there were possibly only 2 drug event pairs that everyone would agree on. We agreed to be under Chatham House rules, I realise, and I shouldn't be quoting individuals. I'm very sorry. But there we go. I break my own rules anyway. But the idea that there should be a reference set, some of us thought there did need to be a reference set. One suggestion that was made that, by me, I must confess, and hence it's being repeated here, is that MEDRA has brought in standardized medical queries. And maybe it would be a task for CIOMS to look at the development of agreed sets. It takes a long time to do that, but maybe we need to do it. But it's hard. It's not easy to find positive controls or negative controls. And there was a lot of disagreement. Simulation was useful for software, useful for checking some kinds of things, but not really for the sort of design issues, essentially. Not really for the common data model itself, but can be useful for checking the design of the software and the analyses to be done. So what are the primary purposes that should be reflected? And the answer was that the EMA should tell us what it is. All right, but that's what the EMA is perhaps wanting us to do. What is the expectation that the primary purposes are? And I think that we didn't have anything that hadn't been said already that are the primary purposes. And I don't know whether it's fair to say that we probably agreed that a key element was bringing multiple data sets in Europe to increase statistical power to answer questions, either by increasing exposure or increasing numbers of outcome events using multiple data sets and obtaining answers that regulators can make decisions on, which may not be perfect data. We acknowledge that the source data itself is not perfect. And if the source data aren't perfect, we can't impose corrections on that very easily at all. We did feel that it was worth, and this is perhaps particularly done by Sentinel, in going back to the providers more readily. We have very little, for example, in CPRD, ability to go back to the general practitioners and make changes in the data. But the ability to do that would be very useful. So should we have a subset of previous analyses be a routine system check? We were in agreement. It shouldn't be a routine check. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So any questions, any comments? I suppose the only comment I would say is that I think in addition to increasing statistical power, it's also to enable a better picture of benefit risk across Europe, because we know that clinical practice influences how drugs are prescribed and how they're used. And currently it's difficult to get that picture across, or it's impossible to get that picture across Europe. So for us, that's also a driver, as well as the rare exposures or rare events and statistical power. Is there any comments?
We did state that. I just didn't. Sorry.
Okay.
We agreed that.
Comments? Questions? Disagreements? Is it getting late? No? Yeah, please.
Hi, it's Danny Hamra from University of Oxford. I've participated in a couple or a few more projects for the EMA with, multi-database and multiple partners around Europe. And I was wondering whether mapping to the CDM will make it somewhat more difficult to do the usual validation of safety outcomes that we usually do on a patient level, or whether this is not going to be a difficulty added by the mapping to a common data model. And I wonder whether someone in the room can answer that.
Well, I can't say that I have enormous experience in the CDMs, but it seems to me the great advantage of the CDM would be that if you were able to do that and build it in as part of your checks, you wouldn't need to keep doing it, because you put a lot of these checkings in the early phases of things. And the picture we had of getting to the CDM, a lot of those checkings can be done prior to it going into the CDM. And if you need to do additional study-specific things, then the time taken to do that should be reduced rather than increased. And that would be my impression. I don't know whether Jeff, John would disagree with that.
John, do you want to comment? Any other comments, questions around validation? Any particular metrics or challenges around what Stephen's presenting? No. Okay.
Can I just make it clear that one of the things that I would argue is that when we do studies across databases and try and check safety outcomes, let us say, we have to do all those checks separately in them. Once we put it into a CDM, then the checks we're doing will be common to all of them. So the effort to move it in the CDM may be greater at the beginning, but the time taken to check it should be the same across each of them. And I think that's your experience in actually doing that.
Miriam?
Yeah, so I think across the European projects that have been running, I mean, some routines to actually do that checking have been developed. I'm talking now, for example, about advanced project is an IMI funded. So currently what we do is like the data is not converted completely into a deep common data model, such as the Sentinel or the OMOP common data model, but it's you are creating readiness because some of the events of interest that you may want to look at, and currently we did like 25, I think, they are being checked and extracted, and they go through this quality check, like incidence rates and all of the checking, so that you're actually ready to act if needed. And because of the differences between the databases across Europe, I mean, that takes time, but that readiness can be created even if you do not convert to a complete common data model yet. But so there is experience in doing this validation or quality checks, and Rosa is developing the components analysis, like how do you do that? So there is ongoing work in Europe to actually do this validation and checking so that you can create the readiness?
But we said that yesterday as well. So in the common data model, there is the creation of the data part and then the analytics. And the analytics, yes, I mean, we have that also with study-specific common data model, and we have experience on that, of course.
I suppose something around the governance we haven't really discussed is the need for, as Sentinel have, the sort of the trusted third party who's kind of policing and dealing with the initiatives or the particular individual studies, and then the Odyssey model where there isn't that sort of centre running and controlling things. How do we see that working within Europe? I guess that's what I would probably throw out. Do we need a trusted third party in order to sort of manage and check the validation is being done?
Okay, so I don't know what it should be because that's not up to me to decide, but my experience so far has been that it's extremely important to have at least, you know, somebody taking that responsibility, to have that role of who is checking the data and coordinating the sites that they actually do it and actually engage with them. For example, within the advanced project, we do that on a weekly basis. So we have 19 databases that meet every week, and they go through quality checks, and they go through this. They have this space to meet and to discuss, and then so that is needed. That needs to be organized, and it doesn't need to be done by a specific entity as long as somebody has that designated responsibility, and it can actually rotate also. But somebody needs to be really key in driving this. Yeah.
I would just add from the Odyssey framework, just to underscore what Patrick said, it's a framework and an enabler. It doesn't specify whether there should be an independent third party or not. I would assume that it seems very beneficial from some of the descriptions that Jeff gave this morning. So Odyssey would not specify one way or the other, but I can imagine it being very valuable and could be leveraged. Yeah.
Can I just comment that one of our participants said that the burdens of regulation have increased on industry. Every time something new is thought of, it ends up adding to industry, and there's never any subtraction. Lots of things in the pharmacovigilance legislation of 2012 were supposed to take away things, and the experience was that they added them. I'm not sure that the common data model is really going to add things to industry, but I shall be extremely controversial and say that the FDA model requires enormous resources in the FDA. You have big resources there for people doing studies, driving the studies, deciding on protocols, and they haven't got those resources here in the EMA. My view is that European regulation should be changed. The member states should stop regulating medicines themselves, all right? That they should become equivalent of LAREB in the Netherlands, and each of the countries should have people who collect safety information, which is varying, and we should have a central organization just like the FDA, and then that should be funded properly by the industry through the sort of, and through taxation if necessary, but with a really big funding, and then we could have real control and we would have a model of that kind. I think in the absence of that, it has other consequences for the way you do things.
Thank you, Stephen. I think that's definitely out of scope for the conference. I think on that note, we will move on. Is Niklas here? Thank you. So Niklas Noren is Chief Scientific Officer and Head of Research at the Uppsala Monitoring Centre, which is the WHO Coordinating Centre. And his topic was, what are the key design choices of a CDM which influence the range of regulatory questions that can be addressed? Thank you, Niklas.
Great, thank you. So we had a very interesting and free-flowing discussions that I think ranged from this specific topic also over into some of the other topics like governance and operations, but I will try to restrict our feedback to the specific aspects related to the design of a common data model. So the first topic that we discussed was what should be the scope of this common data model, and we had already from the start specified, even though the questions had regulatory decision-making, we included also health technology assessment. But we weren't actually quite sure, and I don't think we have the answer. This is more of an open question, I think, back to the EMA. Is the intended scope of the CDM the EMA, or is it a broader use that we're seeing, including also industry and perhaps academic partners, etc.? Because that will influence, I think, what scope we're looking at. So in scope, we include both. Are we thinking, hypothesis testing studies, sort of signal strengthening studies, signal detection? What drugs are of interest, what outcomes are of interest, registries versus health records, and so forth. But we said we can't really answer that until we know, who are we talking about here? Who is it for? Of course, it will be important to know which data sets will be included. And here we had a discussion around sort of current needs, what is in the data today. I mean, that sort of bottoms-up approach that I think we heard from Sentinel. But also there were views expressed in the group that it's important now also to think about the future. I mean, what is it that we would like to capture? So would we be able to capture more of the patient perspective, for example, on the use of medicines? And if so, could the design of the common data model be a driver for the data capture? So that's worth considering. We did say that extensibility is important. So, of course, regardless of which specific common data model is used, it must be easy to extend this so that it does apply to the new data sources that will be available in the future. And that should be a key criteria for the choice of CDM. At the same time, of course, the CDM must be acceptable and to the data owners so that they are prepared if they should be the ones that actually do the mappings. And there must be incentives for the data owners to do that mapping if we come to this ideal scenario of sort of one CDM version of each data set. And then we discussed the possible trade-off between speed and versatility. We actually ended on a very positive note when someone said that maybe we don't have to trade off, maybe we can have both. And of course, that's the ideal scenario. We did agree that if for speed, there must be an option to use standardized design choices. If these are not part of the CDM, as they're not part of the Sentinel and the PCORNET data models, they need to be available elsewhere. And there was the point raised that they could also be part of the actual analysis methods. I think this could be the subject for a deeper cost-benefit analysis to look at the different approaches, see, what are the pros and cons of each in terms of, redundancy, possible inconsistencies, and so forth. So that would have to be looked at. But it's important that it's possible, if we should be able to move at speed, that there are either default choices that you could run with or that it's actually part of the CDM. And then we discussed, because we were discussing some specific areas, and we discussed this, and I don't think in the group we know the answer, but there was a question, if you do include this as derived elements in your common data model, how much adaptability and customizability is there in the transition or the harmonization from the original data to that standardized CDM concept? So for example, we're discussing the drug areas that are available, for example, in the OMOP CDM. If there's a difference in the drug patterns between Germany and, say, the UK, that you'd like to reflect in how you capture your drug areas, is that acceptable to have different definitions of what constitutes a drug area in Germany, that specific German data set, versus how it's captured in the UK data set? Or should it really be the same? Is that part of the definition of the CDM? So maybe this is something we can come back to, because we didn't know the answer in the group, and that would be important. Of course, we also, I think the point was raised that, of course, these standardized design choices are only, I think, useful to the extent that they're actually used by anyone. If people keep overriding them and just making their own choices, that's less valuable. We did think it's not negotiable that the source values should be available so that you can run your customized studies if you'd like, or if you'd like to drive your own concepts. On a related note, we spent sort of dedicated part of our discussion to talk about standardized vocabulary mappings, because it's both, I think, one of the important choices, and it's also one of the differences between the different data models that we've looked at. We agreed that it would be ideal if there were standardized, high-quality, validated mappings that are unique and available to everyone. And that may need to be assessed to what extent that is the case already today, or where we need to improve them. And we discussed, I think, yesterday, percentages in terms of how many of the codes are mapped But more important to me is, of course, how accurate are those mappings? If I take one of those concepts, do I get the right codes? Not just are they all somewhere, but are they in the right place? We talked of the scope of the mapping, and we said that, of course, it's negotiation. How much do you want to cover? And there was a specific example raised. I think it was actually raised over lunch by someone else. It's a French example of crise de voix, which is a very specific French term that may not be possible to sort of get an equivalent to, or some of the read codes that are more administrative in nature. I mean, do we want to be able to map all of them in there? Should we set the scope? And that, I think, brings us back to the earlier question about who's this for and for what purposes. So similar to the earlier slide, there must be a flexibility to build your own groupings as needed. But some of us at least think it may be good with the standard groupings to have those as a starting point. Because if you then go and say, I'm going to use this custom grouping because I think that's what's relevant to me, well, at least that drives the discussion around why I want to digress from that standard choice. And I have to put a motivation, perhaps to the regulator, to say, I'm not using the standard approach, I'm going to use this other approach for the following reasons, as opposed to just presenting it as, this is what I'm going to do. So we thought there was a value in that. Okay, so we're discussing sort of common data models and different common data models, and it seems to sort of defeat the purpose. We did agree that it's ideal if the different common data models used are as aligned as possible with each other. I personally hope that we won't see a sort of a fourth or fifth common data model emerging here. I mean, we can at least build on one of the ones that are there, and ideally see the ones that are out there converge as far as is possible. The point of cost was, of course, raised, especially if you're an organization that builds analysis tools and you have to adapt those to the different common data models. That is not ideal. In terms of quality assurance from a common data model perspective, we said, well, the key things there, beyond what we just heard in the previous workshop, was a version control and tracking of the CDM itself, so that we know what changes have been made over time and which ones have been applied to the data set I'm working on now. And also, if you don't have the sort of the standardized drug grouping, so some of the standardized design choices in your common data model, well, then you need to version control and track that as well. You need to do that separately. I think that brings me to the end of what I captured. So please, if anyone who's part of the discussion wants to add anything before we open up for other questions, that'd be great.
So any questions, comments, thoughts?
So I'll just comment to clarify on the outstanding point that you raised. And I think just for purposes of this conversation, I think we're easily blending data model and analytics. And I would assert that there isn't actually a right answer to this question, but it really is this balance of, are there things that you would like to have consistency and impose, such as you push it on the data side, or are there things you want to have the maximum flexibility so that you want to do it on the analytics side? And at least from our perspective, we've been trying to do both. There are things within the community for which the majority of the time we want to have consensus. So, for example, you mentioned the example of drug arrows. The idea that periods of persistent exposure is something that we generally want to be able to do on a repeatable basis. That's a good construct that you should be able to aspire to have as a common data object. However, your analytics tools should definitely support the idea that in any study-specific circumstance, you might want to tweak those assumptions or modify the rules. And so, within the Odyssey community, not only do we have a common structure that we hope everyone's following the same conventions with agreed community code, but also all of the analytics allow you to say, if you don't like those shared community conventions and you have different assumptions, go ahead and play with them. And I think for the EMA, you're likely going to find that, I heard earlier, I think it was from Peter or elsewhere, there is this issue, or I think it was Jim's comments, like there's something valuable about harmonization that if you can support something that's standardized, there's value in that, but you also have to have the need for the flexibility because there will be circumstances where you're the exception instead of the rule. And so whatever system we come up with, and whether or not you push it on the data side or the analytics side, I think you want to have both the manner to impose harmonization and get the efficiencies when appropriate, but also the flexibility to yield study-specific results when necessary.
So just to follow up on that, but I think the specific question we had was related to one of the common data elements. So is the key thing that they convey the same thing, i.e., you know, a consistent period of drug exposure, or is it that they are actually defined in the same way going from the raw data, so that you allow, if it's 7-day gaps in the UK, it should also be 7-day gaps in the German data, or might you allow 30-day gaps in the German data to get to that same common data element, because you try to capture actually, you know, repeated exposures?
So the specific convention within the Odyssey community currently is that the drug era table is a convention where we're creating periods of persistent exposure at the ingredient level, which usually means rolling up using the vocabulary from all the doses and routes of administration. And that for that, your source data elements could be drug exposures from pharmacy dispensings, in which case you're talking about like a start date and a day's supply, or it could be a prescription written in case you have refills, or it could be medication history and you have a start and end. But whatever that individual atomic drug exposure record, you tolerate some degree of non-adherence, which we have specified as a 30-day window for that, and that you're both rolling up the data at the ingredient level and stringing together exposures. But there are various circumstances where those assumptions, both maybe sometimes you want to do a study that's not at the ingredient level, or sometimes you want to use a different window, in which case your analysis procedure would run that directly on your exposure records.
And is that considered part of the common data model just formally, or is that sort of that?
So the common data model has a table called drug era, and that convention of it must look like this, it must be at the ingredient level, and you have a 30-day window, that's part of it. The code to run that, there are open source codes that you could do that. However, some organizations have different types of drug exposure, so they have to implement it differently.
Any other comments?
Andrew Pfizer, Andrew Bate. So I'm not sure if it's here, Niklas. Did you discuss at all about extra network quality, validation, etc.? I mean, it seems to me that all of these networks, from what I can see, are very good at within network thinking about the challenge of distributed data and not having necessarily access, or often not having access to all the raw data, although some of it's entered in the common data models, but often behind firewalls. What about the issue of how we get from one network that's in one common data model to another network over there that's in another common data model? One network says discordant results cross networks, and how do we facilitate the capability to reconcile differences by understanding the transparency, the reproducibility, and did you have any recommendations around those challenges?
So we tried to stick to the common data model design only. We did digress and discuss some of the governments, but then we tried to pull back. In terms of the common data model, what we said is that, of course, we'd like them to be as close as possible. You know, if there was one, I mean, I think that would be the ideal common data model that can accommodate everything. But we don't know in terms of governance and the fact that they exist out there, how you'd get there. But we said, of course, it's ideal to have them as close as possible.
But any sort of conversing, almost, rather than converting into the common data model, what about the converting out of the common data model? Did you kind of discuss that and how that might? Well, if I see a study and it's using a common data model I'm not that familiar with, how do we build mechanisms, not just, so we've talked about common data models from the sort of facilitating mapping between them. Is there a way of facilitating the interpretability of the outputs? What would have happened had that common data model not been used, and can that network facilitate our understanding of what would have happened, and thereby our ability to more easily understand interpretability of discordance or concordance across systems?
Yeah, we didn't discuss that, but I think it's an interesting question. It seems you would need to have some mapping to first understand how they differ. Then this is a level up, I think, understanding what is the impact of those differences on the outcome of your analysis. But we didn't go into that specifically in the group.
And I guess you still have that problem now. Yeah, it's not good to solve. It's not that much different. Any other comments? Okay, thank you, Niklas. Oh, sorry. What I'm going to do now is stay sitting because I want to write notes. I think that still works with the camera. And what I've tried to do, and we did this over with Jim and I and Xavier overnight, really, and I've added to it over the course of today is to try and put down some guiding principles. And I would really like your feedback on each of these and say what you like, what you don't like, whether we've missed things, whether I think there's probably too many, so we need to cut them down a little bit. But let's have, we've got sort of 25 minutes now of time to have some discussion around these and whether people think they're appropriate. So the first set was more around structure. And I think the first one picks up on the discussion yesterday that a common data model is not just the transformation of the data, but the whole infrastructure and the whole ecosystem. So we try to capture that as a common data model describes not only the mechanism by which the raw data are standardized to a common structure, format, and terminology, but the whole ecosystem, including data analytics and the governance structure, because for us, the governance structure is a very important part of the whole picture. Shall I read through them all and then people can comment? The second point was, and I think this has been reiterated many times, the ability to access source data should be retained. And I don't think I've heard anybody disagree with that in the room over the last day and a half. The common data model should be the simplest that achieves security, validity, and data sufficiency. And I suppose that last point around data sufficiency is an ambiguous term and means different things to different people, but one could expand on that, but this is a guiding principle, so we can't have them as 10 pages long. The CDM should be intuitive and easy to understand. The CDM should allow rapid answers to urgent questions when required. And I think I would like to remind everybody that we still consider that this is going to be a hybrid, there will be a hybrid approach to medicines regulation, and the CDM will answer some questions, but it certainly won't answer all questions, and there will always be a need to do common protocol studies when the epidemiological questions are more complex. And the common data model should ensure transparency and reproducibility of data, tools, and study design. And I'll stop there. I have another 3 pages. So if your favourite's not there, then it will probably come later. So this is more around structure and what the CDM should encapsulate, rather than I've got ones around validity, quality, and utility. So any comments?
Yeah. So I think these guiding principles are very nice. What I'm as a basis, and I think just in terms of terminology, maybe we should think of like, what do we define as the CDM? I mean, for me, it's the data model, and then on top of that, you have all that governance and the whole system. So, but it seems that you take that in one or not. So you have the ecosystem, I think, which has the based on a common data model, and then on top of it, you have all the rest. But the CDM, I think, itself is the data model, more or less, I guess.
Yes, I think I'm picking up on comments that you shouldn't consider the CDM in isolation, but it should be considered sort of the whole package. So how the data analytics run on top of that is also an important part of whether you can trust it, because the validation may be encapsulated within that.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to clarify this because of the discussion that we just had with where Christian was saying, like, you know, even if you have the OMOP common data model, I mean, it can be in an open community, but it can also be in a tightly controlled organization. So it can be utilized in different governance structures. I think that's what I wanted to clarify. So yeah.
Do we need another principle there to capture what you're? We had a definition on the first day around what a common data model is, and I haven't put, that's not what I consider to be a guiding principle, but we said it should be defined as, what I said, as a mechanism by which raw data are standardized to a common structure, format, and terminology, independent from any particular study, in order to allow a combined analysis across several data sets. So that's the common data model. I guess
That's much better.
Yes.
but we need to consider the ecosystem in terms of the data analytics as well. So maybe I need to separate
Yeah, but
those
that
two.
is a separate issue. I think that's been pointed out a number of times. You can have these models. You can have these models. Sorry?
Turn off the mic. There you
I think you need think of the common data model as an important requirement, an ingredient, as something you need to standardize, but you need to layer something on top of that. You need to put it in an organization. You need to assign roles and responsibilities, and that's a whole other layer of decisions you have to make. That's what I tried to point out, that you should view it as the system you're trying to build is a socio-technical system. And the technical part, a little bit, is indeed the CDM, but you cannot view that CDM independent of all the roles and responsibilities, the ecosystem you want to derive around it. And one of the nice things, I think, with the OMOP CDM and the Odyssey is that it does not prescribe how you actually build a system that delivers services on top of that. That's an independent step. And you should not confuse the two. Am I making sense? Or?
So I think you're telling me I need to separate those two bullet points, which is
They
fine.
are separate,
So
yeah.
we'll bring the ecosystem maybe into the governance issue. Okay. Any comments on the other one? Yes.
In general, I agree with that statement. But a little bit of what Alison, what you're trying to pull out in this is that that's true insofar as the common data model doesn't bake in assumptions and study designs. So that's as long as we can divorce that the common data model that you choose doesn't bake in choices for you, then you can separate them.
Was there a comment over here? No? No?
Maybe it's implicit, but maybe we want to emphasize that also free text should be captured. Free text data items. That's something that emerged from work group 1.
Stephen. He's huffing.
Certainly in the UK, you won't be allowed to capture free text because of data protection regulations now. That's the end of it. The only way you'll do that is if somebody has gone through every single line of free text and redacted anything that could identify individuals. And certainly in CPRD, we aren't allowed under any circumstances now to access free text.
But I mean, if in the original data this is available, but of course if it is not available, it cannot be mapped, but it cannot be ETL'd. But if it is there, like in many data sources that we use in multi-database study, it should be included, which is something that is very challenging, but it should be supported because it's very valuable part of the data where it is available.
Oh, I would absolutely agree with you. And if you regard the original data as what resides on the general practitioner's computer that is then extracted in one stage to go to CPRD, then the original source data in that sense does have the free text. But we are left by having had a process that CPRD has already stripped out all of that stuff. And so it is, if you like, its own common data model that has a whole load of restrictions on it.
Actually, I think you're both correct. I think the model should support the fact that you can have free text if the environment in which you are allows you to have free text. So if you're a big hospital system, you can convert your data into a common data model and have everything in there. Patient was referred to Dr. Smith, okay? And because it's in the firewall, it's kosher. And then you can apply analytics to the free text, NLP or whatever you want to do, or LP, maybe we get to that at some point, and create either structured data out of it or create other kinds of insights out of it. And the only person, whoever sees the data, as a piece of software, and we probably don't have a problem with a piece of software violating patient protection rules because, getting access to the data. So I think what we need to do is to be open to that, because there could be different government structures where that's quite possible.
I suppose I would, there's a comment there, but just before, should that be part of a common data model, though? I mean, because those will be quite individual, and should that be something that you want to standardize, or should that be something that when you have a specific question, you go back for further review?
Well, the whole idea of a standard data, I'm sorry, I'm just answering this now. The whole idea of a standard data model is that you do this upfront job, and you can standardize on NLP functionality and analytics. Will be different between different languages, of course, but could be the same for. We actually do this right now for the FDA, because a lot of the blood components are not coded because they're not drugs, and then they won't go to the pharmacy, and there's no pharmaceutical company making them. And so a lot of that information is in the free text, in the discharge summary, when it's described that the patient got 3 packages of red blood cells. And if you want, and the state of NLP is pretty pitiful today, if you want this to get better, to a state like Alexa understanding it actually, it has to be put into a framework where that research and that improvement can be made, and it can only be done in a standard model, in my opinion.
There's a comment at the back, yeah.
Niklas Moore from Bordeaux. I'm very, very nervous about free text. I mean, the whole objective of this common data model is to have reproducible data that is consistent over the whole database, so that when you have a code, and you teach people how to code properly so that all the codes will be the same and mean the same thing. And you're speaking, which is very nice. I mean, when you give drugs, you have ATC codes, or you have the EMFRA codes, or you have the CIP codes, which make sure that you know exactly what packet of drug is given and what. Now, if you start changing that by free text and saying, oh, I gave aspirin, and you don't know, absolutely don't know what it is, or I gave an NSAID or the pill, and you have absolutely no idea of what people actually took, you're back 20 years earlier. You're going back in time 20 years to a time when you don't know what you're doing. The problem with free text is that it is not codified, it's not standard, it's different from one doctor to another. The way there's absolutely no definition. If you don't have free text and you have free text for one, you're opening to all possible biases in your data. So it might be very interesting if you're looking at an exploratory way for very specific adverse reactions. It's just like tweets or social media. It has the same value as tweets or social media, which is essentially, it's interesting, but there's nothing you can do from it scientifically at this point, at least not within a common data model where you're supposed to have the term common. And I'm sorry, but people in the north of France, south of France, in Italy or in Greece don't write the same thing, and you cannot use it. Even if you can put it in a common data model, I do not see how you can use it to have any kind of scientific analysis of something that is essentially hearsay and non-codifiable information, therefore useless information. I mean, I'm trying to get something that works, that might be wrong, that might not give all the answers, but you're not doing a common data model to do pharmacoepi analysis on anecdotes written by physicians.
Yeah, we agree on that. Even nevertheless, there are a lot of good science that we have been doing by codifying some information that was included in some data items in free text.
But not in others, but it's not everywhere, therefore you do not know what is missing, and which means you have Swiss cheese data, which is extremely difficult to use and extremely unreliable.
So I would just make the point that if you do extraction from free text, it needs to be documented as such. So we have a type NLP derived in the condition table so that you know that it's of a particular type. There can be a standard approach where you say if there's a positive mention of a particular condition and it's not negated and it's the subject, it's non-hypothetical, that you can have sort of a standard, but they do need to be documented as NLP derived so that if you want to ignore them, you can ignore them, but if you want to take them into account, it can be useful. So they're not mutually exclusive.
There's a comment down, yeah.
Yeah, just one comment. Maybe to abstract this up, you would just, I think you missed extensible on here, and so the model should be extensible.
That's coming later.
Okay, got it.
And I agree. I think that's the point. I'm not convinced at the moment that you would want to incorporate that. It wouldn't fit 3, simplest that achieves security, validity, and data sufficiency at this point, I think, given especially the comment that is very variable across data sources. We'll park that one for now, if you don't mind. And so this was around operation and governance. So the CDM governance model must respect data privacy obligations across all data partners. The CDM should be built with sustainability as a priority. Development of the CDM should maximally utilize data partners' expertise. And I added this one, the CDM must be agreed by and accepted by the data partners. There must be version control. And I think this picks up on what you just mentioned. The CDM should be dynamic and able to change over time and learn from experience and others. Andrew.
Alison, yeah, I'm not sure whether it's this slide or the previous one. I just wonder if there's a piece about perception around appreciation of it. So it's not just a question of whether the CDM within the network we're confident it's working well, but how do we communicate that to experts outside? So someone who doesn't work with the CDM is still comfortable and confident in the analysis that have been conducted and the reliability and robustness.
Thank you. I don't think that's anywhere. Comments?
Alison, just speaking as a regulator, your last bullet in the previous slide, where you have chosen to use the verb ensure, try and stay away from ensuring anything as a regulator. I think when you were actually going through the slide, you used the word allow. I don't know if you wish to consider that.
Thank you. Okay, in the interests of...
I guess I'm going to do it. One of the reasons we end up with so many models is because the user needs control. So why did the HMO Research Network, why didn't we adopt the HMO Research Network's model or another model? Because we needed to be able to control it. And we can't put ourselves at risk for someone else's decision. So, and then why didn't the HMO Research Network say, well, FDA just put a bunch of money into the model. Why don't we just do that? We're all the same partners. I said, well, if FDA changes their mind, then it's pushing costs on us, and I didn't know about it, and I didn't want to do that. So down the line, what has happened is the primary user is actually the one in control. So you can see a future where, regardless of what's picked, if EMA says we're going here, and EMA is writing a check, if EMA says, I would like that changed, you're gonna branch, and it might be for a subset. The EMA contracts with 10 sites, whatever model, doesn't matter. And the EMA says, this isn't working for me, I need a change. You write in the check, you're gonna get a change, and now I'm bringing this up in version control. Now you've got version 1A and 1B, and they start to diverge. And it's just a clear risk. I don't know that it's actually bad, but this is when you've seen this over time. We started with the vaccine safety data link. Why didn't we adopt that? Well, because I couldn't be listening to what the CDC said. You had to do something else. And it just goes down the line. So in the end, when you create these networks, the folks who need the information should be, and I think this is good, should be in control. Because they're the ones who are standing up in front of the public making the assertions. So that's how I've seen the world work.
Jeff, may I respond to that? Jeff, this is actually fun. This is fun because this, in my mind, is the argument for the community. The sole argument for a community is to prevent an individual from taking control. And indeed, you're totally correct in a sense. When you look at open source communities in general, A fork is driven by significant financial input, usually. And the fork is something everybody dislikes. But I think you're totally right, is that we have this lock-in that if each individual spending some money on any common data model exercise will translate it to my common data model because I need control, then this is a dead-end street.
Simply stating reality.
Exactly, and I agree with you. And that is exactly why I believe that the only way out would be indeed working in communities.
Yeah, I wouldn't spend my money that way.
Possibly.
Not my money.
Christian, and then Anne.
Yeah, I'm also surprised a little bit about the perception of how government should work, like in a fairly dictatorial way. Maybe it works like that in the US. I don't actually think that either. It actually contradicts to what we said earlier, where the data partners have to agree. So now they have to be listening. It clearly doesn't work in the European Union, and actually one of the problems the European Union has is that people think there's too much of that. Too much of just dictatorial decision of how things should be. And the community doesn't necessarily make stupid decisions. And the community, by the way, are those people who are going to have to make the decisions and have to carry out the consequences of decisions coming out of evidence generation like this. And they should be they should be participating, they should be in the picture, they should have a voice. You know, it shouldn't be, you know, again, a dictatorship where one institution declares of how things are, and that's the only way, the only truth.
Now, if I may pick a little bit of a bone with you, I did not hear Jeff say dictatorship. He said I have responsibility, and it is defined in terms of responsibility, and I think that the true dilemma is, and that's also when I listen to, how do I pronounce, Gwen? How do I pronounce your name? Gwen. When I listened to him, he also was very much in, he said, I have a responsibility. So I resent a little bit the notion of dictatorship. I don't think that is fair.
If the FDA can make the decision, okay, then I don't know what else that is.
Andrew.
Yeah, I was just going to make the comment that I think it's challenging. I don't know what the answer is, but I think any community, some people are more influential. Certain people put more resource into a community, and therefore they're going to have more impact, and that's a good thing. But I think it's challenging no matter what we do. There's certain people who are more influential and drive things in certain directions. And we just have to be, I think, transparent and open about how that affects the direction of travel and try and build that into how we use networks and make inference from them.
Thank you. Yep.
Hi, Fredrik Moen from the Swedish Institute for Health Economics. I take the point of Jeff about the model and who's paying and so on, but I think, at least in my mind, I think it would be a mistake to develop a solution that is only for regulators and possibly paid by or through an EMA funding solution. I think we should look for a more open-ended solution, and consequently also, depending on what kind of funding mechanism you then design to support that, may inform some of those decisions.
Okay. Yep. Please.
I guess along similar lines, I think one of the key differences between data custodians in the US and in Europe is that in here, most of the data custodians are actually academic institutions who will want to use these CDMs. And one of the things they will get out of it is actually the potential to run non-regulatory studies and things that are in a different framework, but still relevant to them. So I think that's quite important in terms of the operation and governance.
I think that's a very good point. I'm running a bit over time, but I think Fergus might let me have 5 more minutes. He's nodding, good. Okay, so quality. So the focus should be on data quality. I suppose that's from our perspective as a regulator, but data quality must be defined. We must clearly say how we will define data quality, how we'll measure it, and incorporate and document its corresponding validation. There should be, and you know, that's obviously a long conversation around how you define quality, and it will mean different things to different people and will be variable according to the question. There should be transparency and, where possible, consistency in data transformation across multiple databases. Where divergence is unavoidable, this should be recorded. Any comments? I suppose I would maybe ask Odyssey colleagues around the current consistency across multiple databases in terms of the data transformation. I know that there's got this new grouping in order to try and improve consistency, but maybe just a comment on that from your perspective.
Patrick Ryan. So I would say that this definition here is very much focused on the atomic data. So you're talking about individual data elements, and we did hear a lot of the examples of all the communities who are doing data checks. What is missing from this that has been a focus of what we've been doing in the Odyssey community, but also I heard it loud and clear from Jim, is if we stop using the word CDM and just talk about credible evidence from observational data sources, then the quality we're looking for is to ensure the rigor of the evidence generated, not just ensure the rigor of the individual data elements that are going to make up the evidence. And so the piece that's missing there that we focus a lot on is what in John's presentation was referred to as the methods validation. Ensuring that every piece of evidence comes along with it some assessment of how much you can trust the evidence that you're generating. And I think that's something that I would advocate being a core tenet of what we're trying to do here. So we shouldn't think about data quality as once you've done checks of the underlying data, then whatever comes out is going to be legitimate. You can actually have poor data quality, but could still actually generate a valid piece of evidence. And you could also have spectacular data quality and not be able to generate anything of value.
Yeah, and in fact, the first page had CDM should ensure transparency and reproducibility of data, tools, and study design. So in some way, I need to link that with data quality because they're inextricably linked, is basically what you're saying. Yeah. Andrew?
Yeah, no, I just agree with Patrick. I think we need to focus on the outputs. It's about the common data models facilitating and enhancing potentially evidence generation in some forms and linking that piece in.
If I could to clarify, and I'm going to go back to one of the comments that Andrew made. You were making a comment about like, what if we were to do different data models? And I think, Allison, you said, well, isn't this kind of the situation we're in right now? So right now, Stephen and other members of the PRAC are dealing with the fact that different studies are coming from different organizations following different study designs on different databases, and it's basically just a gigantic mess. What we're trying to do is where there's an opportunity for the researcher to impose control and remove human-made variation, that we try to reduce that so that what we're left with is statistical variation and systems variation. But I think that the opportunity there is how do we actually not get it. I don't think the expectation is that it's going to be perfect, that everything is harmonized, but rather that we're trying to get control over what we have. But the only way that you're going to assess that isn't by saying the underlying data is good. You're going to assess that by seeing that the system as a whole seems to produce the reliable evidence that regulators need to make decisions off of.
Can I say that it's human variation that is unnecessary and unknown?
And I think I was trying to get at that earlier with the ecosystem, and I suppose that's the point, that that data quality is not just the quality is not just the data itself, but how you use it, how you interpret it, the assumptions you make, and so the whole. So I'm going to try and think of a guiding principle which basically says that the common data model should enhance evidence generation in some way. You should have added value from it in order for it to be worth it.
Yeah, so maybe validation should also come attached with the process of the single study. So like for the generation of the variables and the software and the clinical validation, what was the Odyssey group said.
Donald.
Just a question really about guidelines versus enforcing this. I agree entirely that the focus should be data quality, but the reality is is that people are busy, unless they're motivated, as Niklas said, to get some benefit themselves out of getting it really right. The risk is you end up with people very busy doing this. And in the UK, for example, there's been a great move from clerical staff entering to clinicians. And that way, at least you get a bit more knowledge of what people are putting in, and yet they're expected to do more and more without resource. And so I suppose it comes back to this question of who's paying. Is there any way that it's going to be practical to fund? Otherwise, the risk is you have maybe high-quality databases, but with smaller numbers, rather than the real world where you're losing access to where you really want to be.
Jeff, do you have a comment on that? Yeah.
Yeah, so I also broken another rule where I try not to use the term data quality. Of course, I've been using it for 2 days. So you might want to think about it when you're talking with your partners. You're not actually assessing data quality, you're characterizing their data. So we changed all of our terminology to data characterization, because that's really, because nothing else, you can't really do much about it. This is what it happens to look like. But why is it really important? In a large network, someone has to know to not ask that question of that data source, but ask it of that data source, because it's inappropriate here, but maybe appropriate there. That's actually hard to know without some central idea. But what you're doing there is trying to figure out how to characterize the data. I mean, we've been calling it quality, but really we're taking source data, we're just manipulating it, making it look like something else to facilitate our use. But what you really need to do is characterize it. So, why is there no mental health conditions in this database? Well, they excluded those. You can't ask that question there. Well, why don't they put it in there? Because they just won't, right? So you go to the next step. So there's things like that, so I like the term characterization. I think the partners who control the data prefer characterization versus quality as the terminology. But that's all you can really do. But at some point you have to figure out I don't want to necessarily say who's in control, but if you have a network where you've got hundreds or thousands of people asking a question, you would design it differently than if you have a smaller group. There's a lot of implications of that in terms of knowledge management, because you have a huge number of people using it. There's no way they'll understand the nuances in a way that they won't get the wrong answer. Just they'll ask the wrong question of the wrong data, or they'll ask a question and use the wrong data, or whatever. It's too easy to do.
Miriam, thank you.
Yes, I think a term that may actually be better to be utilized in this instance is fit for purpose. So you want to have the characterization to assess fit for purpose, and whatever it is, because that's what you're doing every study again.
Okay, thank you. I'll take those on board. The last, because I know we're at 5 o'clock. Utility. Oh, 4 o'clock, sorry. The CDM should provide a common set of baseline concepts which enable flexibility when required. So this touches on the conversation earlier, but we left that one in because we were thinking about baselines, about speed and timeliness, but also cognizant that we'll need flexibility. All the concepts that are commonly used in safety and effectiveness studies should be mapped to the CDM to maximize utility, but the CDM must be built around the needs of potential users, and that would be all stakeholders. And then the ecosystem should allow the addition of additional databases, that doesn't quite work, but additional databases or data elements as needs indicate. And we'll have 2 minutes on this, and then I'll pass over to Fergus, because I'm sure everyone's got flights to catch. Andrew.
Just to comment on the second one, I think it could be a fine guiding principle, but it could be less ambitious. So you could say, for example, if you only, I mean, I know this is an oversimplistic example, but say you only want to do prescription symmetry analysis, well, you're not going to bother with outcomes, right? Now, I know you want to do more than that, but my point would be then that all the concepts or a subset of concepts. So you could go sort of a gradual build up of the components of it.
I just don't know what we mean by concept. So I can absolutely fully agree or disagree depending on what we define concept by. So let's just go with agree. But it's a tough one, right? Because it can mean a lot of different things to different people.
Okay. I think that we'll call it an end to that now, but thank you very much for it. This will go through many, many iterations. We'll obviously think about it and take the comments from the workshop. Everybody was taking really good notes and rethink. These will come down to much fewer number, because far too many, but it's really just synthesizing and trying to capture some of the thoughts of the last day and a half, which has been incredibly useful. But I'm going to leave it to Fergus to close the meeting.
So, good afternoon, everyone, and it was fascinating. A pity I couldn't attend all of the meeting, but fascinating to hear the early parts and the discussion now. And I think that certainly underlines the challenges there are that we will face with developing these processes and systems, but also the opportunities that they can bring. So I'd really like to thank all of the presenters and everybody in the room, and indeed I can see a few empty chairs, those who've had to leave early, for the very good, excellent quality of presentations and really excellent quality of the discussion. It's highlighted the opportunities, but also the challenges. These have been well encapsulated, but highlighted the regulatory need for real-world evidence and the need for timely access to meaningful, decision-relevant data, and balancing flexibility, because we can't have one-size-fits-all for every situation, but enabling timeliness as well, particularly where we're looking at safety data. As regulators, we do have to make binary decisions periodically on aspects of safety or product authorization, and we need the best data possible to support that. The experiences and presentations on the Sentinel system have highlighted very nicely this focus when a system is controlled by a regulator. And the challenge for Europe will be to achieve this high level of reassurance within our regulatory context, and understanding that the system is likely to be accessed by multiple stakeholders. So as was discussed, even in most recent comments, that raises its own challenges which need to be carefully understood. It's clear that the system should be the simplest, that achieves validity and data sufficiency, but equally should ensure the transparency, reproducibility of data, tools, and study designs. But in order to get that working, we'll need a sustainable governance model, clear protection of data privacy for the data subjects, and really involve the data partners and relevant stakeholders, a very diverse landscape of data sources and databases here. But we do have a rich heterogeneity, I have to say, but that's why we need a common data model, but a rich longitudinal data set in Europe from which we can benefit and which can really benefit the development of medicines, their supervision, and bring benefit to patients. And to come back, and these are June Rain words from the beginning, in order to achieve that, we need meaningful decision-relevant data. So next steps, I understand after that lively discussion on guiding principles, we'll try and digest and bring out also what's come through the workshops and prepare a report which we'll make available in the new year. So as a final statement, I'd like to really thank Jolanta. I can see at the far end of the room, and Alison here to my right. Both have worked immensely hard to make this workshop function, to bring so many people with such a diversity of really valuable contributions together. Really thank you both very, very much, and wish you all a safe, hopefully speedy return home. It's a stable, freezing outside, I think. Best wishes, have a good trip home, and enjoy the end of year celebrations. Happy Christmas and New Year. Thank you.